I, like many of our colleagues, have just flown on our nation's airwaves, going through a fairly crowded airport in Florida, coming into a crowded airport here in Washington. And in 30 days, those TSA lines are going to get longer. For the international flights that I and others have worked very hard to get additional customs agents to cut the time of having to process our international visitors. And in airports like Miami, Orlando, where there's quite a bit of international traffic, getting those additional customs folks has meant a great deal, because we even had some airlines that would come in, for example, to Orlando, and they'd have to keep the international passengers on the airplane for upwards of an hour before they could get off the airplane, so that there was room with the personnel available. Well, you see where I'm going, because all of that's going to change. Unless, as the good book says, come, let us reason together. Unless our sharply divided politics, be it partisan, be it ideological, unless we can come together and reach consensus to stop this ridiculous thing that went into effect last Friday, ridiculous, called a sequester, which was never intended to go into effect, but because of the inability of the parties to come together, in fact, it is in effect, and it is cutting in an indiscriminate way, like a meat cleaver, across the board. And in certain agencies, it even gets exacerbated, like the Department of Transportation, because the cuts can only occur in certain accounts, and thus the civilian employees that are going to be furloughed. Now, it's happening also in the Department of Defense. In my state, in the state of Florida alone, there's going to be 31,000 defense civilian employees that are going to be furloughed. Now, what does a furlough mean? It means that after the 30-day notice, so about 30 days from now, that number of employees in this example in the Defense Department is going to be laid off 1 day a week under the law for up to a maximum of 22 weeks. Now, is that in the interest of national security? Of course not. Why is it exacerbated in the Department of Defense? Because the existing appropriations law, which, remember, we're not operating on a current law, we're operating on last year's appropriations law, that has so constrained the managers, in other words, the secretary, the deputy secretary, such that they can't move the money around. And what they're having to do is to take the sequester cuts out of operations and maintenance instead of out of acquisitions of systems of programs. The worst possible place, out of operations and maintenance. Now, Mr. President, I'm an optimist. I couldn't be in this business if I were not an optimist, and I have ultimate faith in the American people, and I know every one of these senators here, from the extreme left to the extreme right, they're all good people, and there can be consensus found if everybody would get out of their little silos and realize the greater good. But Senator Claire McCaskill and I want to help them. So what we're doing is filing a bill today that will say, since this was never intended, and all these civilian federal employees are going to be furloughed, our bill will say the members of Congress will get docked the same percentage of their pay that the furloughed workers are docked in the percentage of their pay. Now, the question, well, will this pass? Well, I hope it doesn't pass, because I hope that it's not necessary to pass. We have 30 days of notice before the furloughs take place. I'm certainly hopeful that by the end of this month, clearly by the time of the 27th of March, when the existing appropriations bill, which is last year's appropriation, when it ceases to exist and the government will come to a screeching halt unless we continue the appropriations for the remainder of the fiscal year. So I'm hopeful that our legislation won't pass. But somebody needs to understand how ridiculous this whole thing is. Conservatives want to cut spending. Well, you can do it in a more intelligent and rational way. And if we're going to get serious about $4 trillion of deficit reduction over the decade, and we've already enacted policies that will take us down about $2.5 trillion of deficit reduction. So we've got about $1.5 trillion to go in enacting policies over that decade. We ought to be able to do that in a nanosecond. So Senator McCaskill and I want to try to help nudge the process along. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you're going to dock all of these civilian employees who have lives, who have families, who have children, who have expenses, who need to buy milk, and so forth and so on, you're going to dock them their pay because of the inability of the members of Congress to get together to do what should have been done, by the way, a year and a half ago when this whole thing was enacted. The meat cleaver sequester was put there because it was so ridiculous. Surely it would encourage, a year and a half ago, the super committee of 6 from the House, 6 from the Senate, half and half of each party. Surely it was going to encourage them to come together in agreement. All it needed was one vote. Instead of a 6-6 deadline, it would have been 7-5. It didn't happen. And here we are, a year and a half later. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you're going to dock federal workers a pay because you're going to force them into a furlough, which was never intended, is not rational policy, is not good administration, then you're going to be docked your own pay. This is not pontificating. Again, I say, I hope this never passes because I hope it's moot. But it's trying to bring into focus just how ridiculous things are going on here right now. And so I'm very hopeful. And I say, I love the members of the Senate, every one of these members of the Senate. I have a great relationship with almost every one of these senators. And they're all good people. And we need to come together, give a strong statement of consensus building, and then send it down there to the House and tell them they've got to get off the dime. Thank you for letting me share this, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.